Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Destination Big Leagues. In today's episode, I've got Jonathan Kurniawan on the podcast. He is currently the CTO of Prodago. Prodigo is an AI governance SaaS tool. He's previously been an AI team lead and a research analyst on AI policy and governance. He's super credentialed, and I think he's the perfect guy to have a conversation on AI governance, on generative AI governance, and the future of how the tech regulation landscape is going to shape up. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for coming on to the podcast.
Thanks.
Really excited to have a really interesting conversation. So, would you want to kind of go ahead, kind of quickly introduce yourself, talk about your work experience? How did you get to the point of becoming the CTO of Prodigo? And yep.
Yeah, thanks, Ronak. So, thanks for the introduction. So, my journey into the space of AI governance started back in 2018 when the idea of AI ethics and AI governance was really more of an academic pursuit. And you have like professors talking about, how do you make sure that the AIs that we're building, that are black boxes, are not going to be misrepresenting the outcomes that you were looking for, and they're not aligned with what the intentions are of what users are looking for. And that really intrigued me because it's really in the center of a lot of different type of topics. I was a software engineer by training, and so the technical aspect kind of intrigued me. But then there's also the societal impact, right, and sociology, and kind of thinking about how does technology affect us in ways that want to make sure that technology actually helps us, not actually like we're not governed by technology that's outside of our control. So that's really what started my journey into understanding about this space a bit more. And once I understood it, it's actually super multidisciplinary. And I think, Ronak, you're probably also well aware with, especially these conversations right now, what you have in 2023. And there's so many sides of the debate of, is AI going to kill us all? Is it going to take all our jobs? Is it going to, how do I know that the AI is actually going to be doing the right thing? How do I know it's not, this super intelligent thing that's trying to, be a Skynet reality, right? So there's dystopian, but also there's a lot of promise with AI. And my job here is to help people, teams to understand how do we have the right guardrails and the right due diligence to make sure that technology serves us and not the other way around.
Right. No, I mean, I think totally well said. I think, we want to let's try regressing back a little bit and trying to kind of just understand, because traditionally large scale companies have had this thing called data governance, having policy and procedures and kind of how they maintain their data, traditionally, kind of AI governance is kind of a new emergence, proliferated by kind of the GPT acceleration and the boost. So, can you maybe run through kind of the distinction on how traditional data governance has been run and how AI governance is going to be run, and what is kind of the key
Right.
distinction, and the key challenges.
Yeah. So governance and data governance has been around for a while, and you would see large organizations and generally highly regulated organizations working in regulated industries requiring large data governance functions and operations. So if we to really distill down what data governance is about, it's about setting the right policies for data and then enforcing those policies. So if things are generally a people, process, tools perspective, governance is really the people and process, right? Who has the right accountabilities, who is doing the right controls, who are making sure that things are getting done the right way. There's some form of oversight, there's some form of accountability and transparency. And so that's really what governance is about. And data governance has many different aspects to it, right? You have the data management, data quality, data lineage, and then so on. And it's all to ensure ultimately to provide trust. So you want to have trusted data, you want to be having reliable data, you want to make sure that you're doing all these processes to ensure that when you get the data and you want to use some for whatever reason analytics purposes or for reporting purposes, that it is sound. So that's the idea of data governance. Now, AI governance is a natural extension of that because an AI system is nothing more than data and a model and an outcome, right? So the scope of data governance, if data was just the model input, then you have the model and model output that you have to include as well as part of AI governance. Now, on top of this, because AI has such wide ranging implications, it's not only about the model and the model output, but also the context of the use case that you want to use has to be governed as well. And this is probably where we're going to go a bit deeper when we start talking about the risk-based approaches of some form of regulations that's happening up in the EU, where the context of the use case is highly pertinent to identify how much controls you want to put in, or the fact that maybe you can't even do those use cases yet in those markets. But in general, so if we scope it out, data governance, the existing best practice of data governance must still be done for models. In fact, it's even more important because you want to make sure you have highly trusted data, but then also the model and model output and the context of this AI system.
Right. So I guess at what stage should a company sort of really start worrying about AI governance? You know,
Yeah, it's something that's important, I think, for maybe we start with an analogy, right? So the idea of AI governance is that you're doing due diligence and you're doing extra work to provide responsible, trustworthy AI, right? So that's your North Star. If let's say there's a Venn diagram of like, here's AI, and then you have a smaller Venn diagram of responsible AI or trustworthy AI, then the question is, if you don't do the governance, then it could be outside of that circle, right? So do you want to use that type of AI? So that's like a really simple thought question to ask yourself, like, are we ready yet to add extra processes to make sure that we are going to be responsible? If you're using, let's say, a spam filter chatbot for Gmail, and you think, as a sanity check, common sense check, you're like, it's not going to really be the end of the world. It's also maybe only a proof of concept. Then maybe it's not necessarily required, right? Because you're still sandboxing it in a particular way. Then probably you're not at that level of maturity yet. You don't need it. But at the same time, if you think, okay, you know what, if this actually becomes live, it's affecting a lot of people, and it's highly critical in the way it's being run in terms of the use case, then you would definitely want to add more and more stuff. And so this is all a spectrum, right? And you can add best practices of data governance, and then start adding in like model governance and model output governance and the ML ops, and so you can start layering it. This is all kind of a journey, right? It's going to be it's a continuous maturity towards more and more governance, but you don't want to do governance just for governance sake. It's always That's why I always want to start with, is it okay if this thing you're building right now, like how much trust do you need at the outcome?
right. No, that totally makes sense. Like, so with, with kind of AI governance in general, right? I think you mentioned the word responsible AI, right? Do you mind kind of digressing and kind of unraveling kind of what does responsible AI mean? What does it mean to be responsible?
It's a very good question, and I think there's a lot of debate on a lot of experts. What does it exactly mean? Definitions. And especially in the legal sense, definitions are incredibly important because they want to make sure that there is a boundary of what is responsible and what is not responsible. So let's take out the legal and legality aspect for a second, and I'll just take my perspective of what responsible is. Responsible means you're building a technology with intention, and the intention of making sure that it's going to be helpful, and you're making sure that there are known limitations, and those known limitations are communicated well to the users of the technology, and so that can be used responsibly, right? So if we take the analogy of what normal engineers do, like real engineers, we're programmers, we're coders, we like to think we're engineers, but we're just typing on a keyboard. But real engineers, they actually build stuff, right? And so if we're building a bridge or building we're in Dubai, so the Burj Khalifa, there's going to be requirements to make sure that it has the sort of tensile strength that it can withhold the wind shears at particular storms, and if there's a bridge, there's a clearance height of how much it has to be so that you can allow cars and trucks of particular sizes to go through. So there's all these considerations of usage and use case and all the thoughts of how to make sure that what you're building doesn't break. And if it does break, you know the limitations of where it breaks, and so therefore you can maybe close the bridge, or maybe you can say, when we just had a really bad storm in Dubai last week, right? When it got really really bad, they shut down the view at the top of the bridge because it was not safe at that height, right? And it was really really stormy. So then there's also known, so there's a process involved as well. Okay, the structure works, but then you want to make sure that people are safe as well. And so that intention is ultimately, in my mind, how you want to build more responsible AI. And then the
Right.
governance is how do you operationalize it through controls, through activities, through accountabilities, and we can talk about details on all the different parts. But effectively, that's what good governance is supposed to be about: ensuring that your intentions uh, are communicated and actually get done, and you're mitigating unintended consequences.
Right. No, I think you kind of nailed it in the sense saying that the intention really matters, right? Like what you're building, what is the intention for it? I know that Microsoft kind of had a white paper where they kind of guidelined their key points. I think there was about 6 points within it. They had sort of fairness, mitigating bias, inclusivity. How do companies kind of incorporate all of these things, especially that most companies today out there, especially enterprise companies that aren't tech first, are not really building these LLMs from scratch. They're basically using other LLMs from OpenAI, from Facebook and Anthropic. Uh, so, how should someone kind of, ensure that their AI that they're deploying out there into production is adhering to, responsible AI principles of like fairness and equity and mitigating bias?
Right. And that's a really great question. I don't think there's a one size fit all. That's the first thing that we have to recognize. Even in the same industry, the context of the organizations and the business that they do and the operations they have and the data, it all affects how they're going to implement it. But if I go back from a high level again, I call governance as policy setting and policy enforcement. So if we start with the policy setting perspective first, that's where we identify, all right, which principles are important. Then you go one level deeper than principles, right? Okay, fairness, but what does the fairness actually mean? Right? And you say equity, what does it actually mean? Organizations have done already have a function to do this without AI. That's usually the one that creates the code of ethics, code of conduct for an organization. They would need to extend that thinking to how they would use for AI. They could see the different types of frameworks and different paradigms to say, okay, what does it really mean, and kind of like uh, express it quite clearly. Then from there, you want to create the right policies, right, and explain what does it mean from an organization perspective. What are your internal policies? How and what are your external policies? How do you deal with that? You can use frameworks. So, for example, if we're talking about using third-party tools, right? Like OpenAI is a third-party tool, Anthropic is a third-party tool. Not everyone's going to build their own models from an open source model, let's say. Um, you can then use frameworks related to third-party risk management on AI models. There's one that the World Economic Forum created related to third-party. There's a procurement third-party framework to review risk on these different third-party tools, and so that all needs to be done with the team that usually does the policy setting, and that's usually a multidisciplinary effort. You have legal and compliance, but you also have risk because you want to understand the risk tolerance, right? That so risk is the risk function in an organization is very helpful because they are the bridge with the business and business use case and what is happening to ensure that the organization continues. And you got the compliance, and so the risk team can kind of give you, all right, here's our risk tolerance, here's how we're thinking about it. And so you have the conversation, then you do the policy setting, right? And so and this is going to be a continuous process. From there, you if you go even deeper, then okay, then exactly what does it mean in terms of the operations? That's when you have the policy enforcement. Then you in your risk teams kind of enforcing the controls. You're creating committee structures and governance structures to have regular touch points. You have some form of oversight to allow organizations building the AI with, and you kind of have to do it together, right? The idea of these governance structures is not to be what you call red tape, because I was on the other side. I was an engineer. I thought this was red tape, but the idea here is that the governance structures can actually enable and actually should help to make things a lot more smoother in terms of making an AI system that actually goes into production.
Right. I think the key thing is about, like, as you've also kind of mentioned, like, defining what these words means, right? Like, because we're kind of at a point where at a new revolution, and everything is like ground zero right now, where we really have to define what the words that we're saying really mean, right? Like, what does equity mean? Like, what does equality mean? What does fairness mean, right? Because there is quite a lot of subjectivity. If you ask two people, like in a game, what is considered fair, the two people might have two different opinions on what fair really means to them. So kind of going through and underlining what the guidelines of those words and jargon that we're using is super important. Because
Exactly.
these like responsible AI has ramifications for all of us, because we all have to kind of abide by it. So
That's
it's
right.
super important for us to have a say in it. you know
And the taxonomy, that's what you call a taxonomy in the governance world, where it's a very precise definition of what we're trying to say. And I think it's very important to say that, the organization has a perspective, and that's the perspective that they want to enforce, right? That's the idea. The employees might have different opinions, but ultimately, if you're an organization, you're thinking about how does that what does make sense for that organization, right? And how do they go. I'll give you an example of where this can uh, be a point of contention and discussion. So, for example, the principles of privacy in general, people say that's great, right? We want to make sure that we ensure privacy and user data, and they kind of have their own things. GDPR has a lot of requirements in terms of different rights that people have, and so on. So, in privacy, there is an idea or a principle called minimization or data minimization, where you want to minimize the amount of data footprint that you have on the users. This principle is directly opposed to LLMs, for example, because the definition of LLMs is large, right? There's already a large amount of data that's been trained on. So now the question about okay, what's fair is minimize data minimization part of fair, or is part of privacy enhancing, or is it actually no? That's something that we're okay with, right? And that's never a right. And there's no right and wrong answer, I would say. And it's going to be for the organization to decide, because there is a risk involved if you don't comply with them or you don't do something about it. And that depends on use case, depends on context, depends on so many different things. And that's why it's super important, like you said, to be very precise. Okay, is this in or out? Is this in or out?
yeah, no, yeah, I mean, that is actually quite interesting. Yeah, I mean, it is quite interesting. So, can you lay out kind of the AI governance, AI regulatory landscape? Like, how are different countries looking at it? How are the Europeans looking at it? How are the Americans looking at it? What are the other countries? At what stage are they in terms of adopting sort of regulations?
Yeah. So I would classify broadly, there are three buckets, right? And some countries can be joining multiple buckets, but they're just generally in three different buckets. The first is about using existing laws and regulations to help drive it into AI, right? That's what you see in the UK, for example, and the UK kind of have what they call a pro innovation stance, because they don't want to be quick to regulate. They want to say we have existing regulations, we want to continue with them. Industries have their own regulations, we want to continue with them, and so there's existing privacy regulations or existing like internet communication regulations that they continue. So UK, India, they're kind of following in that bucket. Then you have another one where it's about introducing new regulations. And this is in the large part is largely driven right now by the EU. Especially, I have the thing called the EU AI Act, which is going to be uh, basically in effect next year, but then they give you 2 years to comply before they start enforcing it. So by like 2026, that's at least the current expectations in the market. But let's so like the EU is creating their own regulations, and this is like something very specific about how does AI systems differ from existing systems. Then you got another spectrum of countries where they just outright ban particular things, right, and particular use cases perhaps. And yeah, so those ones were like, there was a time where very briefly Italy banned ChatGPT, right? And there are still some countries which still ban ChatGPT services and stuff like that. So and then there's of course the mixtures of these three different buckets. So for example, China is a mixture of the creating of new regulations, but also banning certain services. So, for example, China has a very different approach than the EU AI Act, which is a AI risk based approach. They have different use cases and classifying different risk. If things are forbidden or things are high risk, what sort of controls you need to have. That's the EU version. Whereas China is more about specific use cases. So if you are a recommendation system or you are a what they call deep fake synthetic media system, right? They have different regulations on these and they are banning certain use cases of AI. So that's kind of how things are evolving. And you will, I guess, see where it's going to go because it's still quite early stages. Like the EU AI Act is probably the most closest to actually being applied. And if it is, it's going to be a really big impact, not just to the EU market, but actually to the rest of the world. What we can see from, let's say, 2016 to 2018, when GDPR was announced in 2016, 2018 it was announced, it was launched. The effect of GDPR affected even beyond the EU market, right? That's what you call the Brussels effect. And other countries, like for example, Chile was saying, if you're compliant with GDPR, you're good for us, right? And you're gonna start seeing some countries like that as well. But right now it's still very early days. That's the regulation market in general. And so right now, when I'm talking to my clients, my customers, what they are looking for is, all right, so in this level of uncertainty seems like there might be things about existing regulation or if it's new regulation or maybe they're banning, like, what do I do about this, right? There's another approach as well where you don't need to use the regulations or wait for the regulations to happen. A lot of these regulations and policy documents, they often reference other documents as well, for example standards. So, as to this recording, about 2 weeks ago, we had an executive order from the U.S. from Biden and Harris, talking about how do you build safe AI systems, and they have a particular implementation, a recommendation of how to implement this in the federal government in the U.S. As part of that executive order, they are referencing the risk management framework created by NIST, and NIST itself has already gone through a couple of different drafts, and they have particular operations of how to uh, map, measure, manage, and govern the AI systems. So that's their whole AI risk management framework. So, while we're waiting for regulations, this doesn't mean that we just don't know what's going on. There are standards there. If you don't like NIST, there's others as well. There's ISO, there's Senelec in the EU, right? So you have a lot of different standards bodies who are creating these different standards, and some of them are probably more mature than others, and you can see that as uh, definitely a guidance while you're waiting for regulatory confirmation of where it's going to go.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite interesting. If you were to advise governments, how would you say that they should view, the proliferation in AI? How should kind of they get their heads around it to make sure that they have regulations that are protecting their citizens, but also ensuring that, they're not stifling innovation?
Yeah. And this is where it's really important for a country to think about this very deeply. And when we're talking about advising countries, the most important thing is to align and create an actual AI strategy. If they have a national AI strategy, which they have thought about and thought deeply about what does it mean for us as a country in the new world of AI, what is our place, how we're going to use it, how we're going to have it grow our economy, how do we have it affect our citizens, how we're going to attract talent. Like there's all these sorts of conversations that needs to be had and a decision to be made on what's the strategy for a country. So the first thing is create an AI strategy. If you don't create an AI strategy, the general thing would be you're just going to be a quick follower, and the strategy could be also a quick follower, that's also fine, but have a strategy. From those strategies, then you need to create those principles as well, right? We spoke about policy setting from a company perspective, but from a country perspective, is also policy. There's also principles that you want to adhere to. And one of the great things here is there is an acceptance of AI principles, of the UNESCO AI principles, by like 192 countries. All the UNESCO members have agreed to sign to these, and these are generally pretty good principles as well. Then you want to go further and say, okay, so now you got the strategy, you got principles. Now, how do you start operationalizing it? Right? And that's depending on generally what sort of investments you're putting in, right? What's the sort of teams that you have? What's the sort of focus? Do you have a departmental focus on this? Is it a priority for you? And when you have that sort of momentum, then you can start executing projects, and maybe you can have small projects, large projects, and kind of like figuring out the thing. If we are going to like one example, right, is so we have the EU and the whole thing. I think that's already quite clear how they're building the EU AI Act, and how the different member states of EU is contributing and debating and refining the EU AI Act. You have other groups as well, which is outside the EU, where you have international cooperation, trying to figure out, okay, so what does it mean for us? So one thing that happened, led by the UK, is what they call the Bletchley Declaration. Recently, about 2 weeks ago, UK launched this declaration of how we want to have safe AI, and working with 28 different countries, including the UAE. And they are saying, okay, here is how we want to be doing it, working and cooperating with different countries. I think that's also another really important piece, because you don't want to be left behind. You want to be part of it, part of the discussion. You want to hear how different people are influencing, because this is actually a really big part of how you influence. How AI is going to be used and developed in your way, right? So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I think it did. Uh, well, so you talked about kind of the U.S. Uh, passing their executive order under the Biden and Harris administration. The U.S. was kind of lagging behind compared to the Europeans. Uh, I know that I read that one of the things was, if you're above a certain amount of parameters, they're going to go into your code base and try to diagnose like what's happening. Like how do those type of regulations like make sense? If you go and talk to some of the top tier AI experts also out there today, it is so difficult to pinpoint like, okay, this is XYZ input and I'm getting Y output, or a Z output. Like it's like what happens in between is just completely an anomaly. Like no one really knows what's happening. How do you feel about governments going inside the code base and trying to diagnose what the root cause issue is, or why a certain model is behaving in a certain way? Is that even feasible?
Yeah. So let's recognize first that it's a good thing that governments are thinking about how do we make sure AI doesn't go off the rails. So the first, like, I think you made a really good observation that the US has been slow to respond relative to the EU, right? The US has been actually the biggest creator of these AI systems. OpenAI, Anthropic, these are all American companies, right? At the same time, the regulations that is being the executive order that was drafted were very, very prescriptive about particular details that will be completely outdated, maybe even in 6 months, right? If you're saying
Right.
number of parameters as a large language is this much, yeah, in 6 months it's going to be the norm, and so everything's going to be regulated, right? So there's an invasiveness to it as well. um, and there's always these realities of where countries want to build their regulations and how deeply and how much control they have. And I think the idea is, how do you make sure that the process of creating this sort of guidance has some form of feedback loop? I think one thing that was good about this executive order is it's not exactly a regulation yet, right? So that's one of the good pieces. The other thing is there's also a draft process to get feedback, and so what remains to be seen is, are they going to be capturing this feedback like you were mentioning? You have all these AI experts coming in and saying, these details don't make sense, they're going to be outdated and archaic in 6 months, what's going to happen later on? So if we have a good process, then the process would be all right, updating the guidance and perhaps shifting in a better way, right? So I think there is the feedback process is the right process, because you cannot say this from like here it is one time go, right? It's going to have to be evolving with the market. But yeah, we'll have to see if they actually listen to the feedback and it's going to be implemented and improved.
Right. I think one of the kind of problems with I think the feedback process is definitely the better approach. I think one of the problems what happens is all these large scale companies like OpenAI and Microsoft and Google, they're all at Congress testifying about the need for and the importance of AI governance and some regulatory board ensuring that there's some level of enforcement so these technologies doomsday scenarios can be curtailed. Uh, but what ultimately uh, inevitably happens is these large scale companies have that money and the lobbying effort to go out there to shape up Congress's mind, but the biggest impact happens to all these young entrepreneurs who've with very minimal resources set up an AI company. So how do we make sure that these large scale companies don't regulatory capture and ensure like
Yeah.
innovation still proliferates, within the
So
small
this
entrepreneurs as
that's
well?
a hard question to answer, because the question would be like, how do you stop large companies from, yeah, like you say, regulatory capture, lobbying for things that they've already done the training of the data, and now you say, okay, I'm going to close the door behind me, right? Like it's a difficult question to have. I think what I would suggest is that the focus should be perhaps closer to how the EU AI Act is focused on it right now, which is about use cases, because that's what we all fundamentally agree about, right? If it is a highly critical use case of an AI system, for example, when I say critical, I mean critical infrastructure like traffic lights and like energy sources, right? Like for power, and maybe the justice system, the police system, hospital systems, right? These are critical infrastructure stuff, and you do want to ensure that they don't break and they don't do things unintentionally, right? So those use cases make sense, and even startups trying to attack those use cases, they must adhere to some form of controls, so that, because the outcome of a bad outcome there is people's lives, right? And so fundamentally, from a use case perspective, it makes a lot of sense to force higher risk use cases to have more controls. And I think regulations that generally touch in that direction will help. The more invasive approach of double checking, particular code bases, if there are particular parameters, this seems to be very specific and very difficult to ensure that this is going to give you more responsibility. So I think it has to come back to what's the outcome you want to create, right? And if the U.S. Congress was thinking of it in this way, and let's say, lobbying, how do you stop lobbying is going to be its own question, but really, how do you think about what's the better approach? It has to always come back to, okay, so what's the outcome you're going to get out of this, right? This regulation, when you're doing this, regulations in general, they have an intention and also a adverse effect of unintended consequences. You create noise, right? So you want to make sure that it's worthwhile, not just like adding a auditors just for particular parameter sizes and so on.
Right. So, this is kind of one thing that was going through my mind when we were having this discussion. In terms of the robustness of these LLMs, right? How good should they be on a percentage basis relative to a human that it would be fair to deploy on critical infrastructures, right? Within like healthcare and criminal justice and stuff like that, right? So let me kind of run you through an example that I was kind of thinking. Like, let's say well, fundamentally, right, these LLMs are probabilistic models, right? They are good at determining the probability of the right answer, right? I don't think fundamentally today these models inherently even know what they're spewing out, but they've learned over a large set of data sets, and they know like the probability of hearing this answer and being satisfied with it is going to be more, so they will output that answer. So let's say if within the healthcare sector, if someone was going through a traditional doctor and an AI doctor for a recommendation, I think the traditional doctors also give misdiagnosis and medication. Let's just for to make a point, say that traditional doctors make misdiagnosis in terms of medication about 5% of the time, and these AI systems make a misdiagnosis about 3% of the time. Is that sufficient enough to deploy these models completely and trust and rely on them since they're better than the human counterpart?
Yeah, so let's take the regulation piece out of the way first, because regulation will probably have some particular thresholds of these use cases. So let's say you're doing this as a company, right? And you're building an AI system for this. And I think AI system is the right word, because necessarily not only about the performance of the model, but sometimes your system, right, is also the design of the system is important. And if we come back to how I mentioned governance is about policy setting and policy enforcement, the policy setting perspective is what's your risk tolerance to different risks. And if you have 3%, 5%, you have to go a bit deeper than that. So what is this? What is a 3%, 5%? Is this a false positive or false negative? Is the use case that you want affecting, like, in medicine, as you know, as data scientists, we know that we have this thing beyond just accuracy, which is specificity and precision, right? And if you want to reduce false positives, you want to have higher precision. If you want to have a higher, you want to lower false negatives, then you have a high specificity. So, for example, with medicine, you generally want to minimize false negatives. And if you have a misdiagnosis of, say, yeah, you no, you're fine, but actually you have cancer, like that's a really bad example, right? Like that's a really bad system, even though the performance might be better than a human, right? So you kind of want to get to that level and maybe a bit further in terms of the use case. So understanding that, and then linking it back to a risk tolerance perspective, gets you a perspective of, here's our positioning. Once you have that positioning, then you can decide whether or not this AI system as it stands is good enough or not. On top of that, it's not just going to be about the performance of the LLM, it's about the design of the AI system. Because if, let's say, we are not quite ready for this level of risk tolerance for this and this reasons, then you want to have maybe a human in the loop, right? So it doesn't need to just be an AI system that deploys on its own autonomously, but then maybe you have people that's checking, and there's different ways for you to have different controls to make sure that there's the systems are not going to be making decisions automatically without human in the loop that actually can be super adverse to another person. So that's how I would think about it. And again, it depends on the different aspects. So you would start with an assessment, like a risk assessment, risk tolerance assessment, policy and positioning. Then you figure out, okay, how do you implement this?
Right. No, I totally agree. Kind of, is it a false positive? Is it a false negative? I think really unraveling those key components also is pretty important, to see like how well it is performing. So yeah, you're totally right. You don't want it to say that you have cancer, but you actually don't have it. So the false
Exactly.
positives are kind of crucial. But
False
yeah,
positive, false
so
negative is
you are the
important. and,
CTO.
and you also want to know that if with LLMs, there's this thing called hallucinations, right? And
Right.
hallucinate there's different types of hallucinations, there's different consequences of hallucinations. So yes, it's probabilistic, but then probabilistic in what way? And I think the most other important part to understand is it hallucinating in a predictable way? If it is, then perhaps you can counteract it. If it's not, then is that uncertainty and unreliability something that you're willing to risk? That's why it comes back to a risk perspective in this case as well, right? Like, because if I were to extract out at a very top level, there's three things that you really want to capture from a responsible perspective, whether it is effective, whether it's compliant, and whether it is ethical. And effective means you want to reduce functional risk. So the reliability aspect, the SLAs, we talk false positive, false negatives. Compliant, minimizing legal risk. And then ethical, because you want to minimize reputational risk. So, because reputational risk is also a big part of how you want to make sure that the AI system doesn't bankrupt your company.
Right, right. So, you're the CTO of Prodigo. Uh, you are an AI governance SaaS tool. I would think that traditionally these AI governance pieces are going to be built by the consultancy companies. But what is the market opportunity for an AI governance SaaS tool? how do you see Prodigo shaping up in terms of companies implementing a SaaS tool to ensure, they're creating principles to abide by, and then policies and procedures, and then ensuring that they're enforcing all of those things to make sure, they're adhering to their AI governance frameworks that they've built.
Yeah. So it's still very early days, and regulation is early days. So tools are also in the early days, and we're trying to figure out what the category really means. There's different competitor spaces, and you can focus it more on the ML ops side. You can focus it more on the metric side, and you can focus it on the oversight side. What our focus and my focus been in the past couple of years is on the people and process side, and specifically what are the sort of things that people need to do to ensure good governance. And so I'm really in the due diligence people process side. um, do you have anything more specific than that, Ronak?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to kind of understand. You said, like, it is the Wild West. We're in the early days. You know, I just wanted to kind of understand, like, how you thinking about building Prodigo. Why should a SaaS tool like this exist,
Got it.
and what's the key benefits that users of this tool are gonna gain out of?
Right. So if I come back to the risk perspective again, and we have like the reducing functional risk, reducing legal risk, and reducing reputational risk, this equation makes sense from a risk tolerance perspective. And your risk tolerance is generally, uh, is correlated to how much trust you need in of your customer, your end user, of you as an organization, right? So, for example, our most of our clients are in the public sector, and public sector governments. They That's literally their definition, right? They want to have trust of their citizens, right? So,
Right.
if you have a high requirement of trust, that means you must have a lot of investment to make sure that the risks are not realized, right? So it becomes a proportion, a percentage of your development, of your AI development cost, to ensure that the risk doesn't get realized. And so in general, the industries that have high risk or requires high trust, they will invest a lot. And traditionally you see the same thing in data governance as well, right? For banking, they would, general rule of thumb is about 10% of the development cost is spent on risk and compliance and GRC and so on, right? So 10% of a usual project, it's quite a lot. If you imagine it's an AI project, that's also quite a lot, right? So as the evolution of AI and the adoption of AI gets more mainstream, and the use cases are more and more on these use cases that require a lot of trust, the demand for governance is also going to increase. And so what we're banking on is, we're hoping to help organizations to get the value out of AI, but don't have the risk of unintended consequences affecting their users.
Right. No, I mean, yeah, that is a pretty ambitious goal. I think you guys can definitely, are well positioned in a market that is so large to kind of advise companies and ensure that, they're adhering to their principles. And yeah, I mean, it is definitely a quite interesting field. We're definitely in the early days. It's when we have this conversation a year ahead, it might be a totally different thing.
That's right.
Maybe by then, like 50% of the workforce is going to be robots. So we're going to talk about what the
There you go.
human robot relationship is going to be like. So yeah, I mean, it was super insightful. I think this is a really engaging conversation. Is there any closing words, any closing thoughts, uh, anything that you want to let people who've listened to this podcast know about yourself or know about Prodigo, and how can they reach out to you?
Yeah, so you can reach out to me on my LinkedIn. I guess it's going to be links of my profile
Sure.
in the podcast episode. Reach out to me, have a chat. I love hearing and having conversations about AI governance, and just like the role of AI, and how do we work with AI in general. Shoot me a message, and really keen to have the conversation continue. Thank you so much, Ronak.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone. Okay, I think that was great.